Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around we are on a glacial lake playing as the Dark Elves against the Empire, so a little bit of an unusual matchup for me, not being an Empire player for once. But regardless, for this composition I was looking to actually take on the Empire with a very cav heavy build, and inspired a little bit by what some other players have been doing, as well as just my own personal thoughts on what in my experiences, are some of the more competitive builds against the Dark Elves from the Empire side of things. It's either they go very cav heavy, or Empire goes very, very heavy on shooting and sort of skirmishing builds with like a decent amount of sort of peripheral defenses, and then a whole bunch of handguns, crossbows, etc. So I decided to make a build that was very cav-centric, figuring that if my opponent tries to take me on in a cav fight, I'll have the resources to take on him. If he tries to take me on with shooting, I'll be able to overwhelm the backline. So for this build, regardless, let's kind of just hop right in and discuss what we brought and why. For my lord, I did decide to bring, and this was a very small map as well, so I figured that cavalry in this sort of situation, if my opponent brought artillery, I'd be able to gap close pretty safely, pretty efficiently, and just get on top of his army as well as I could. So as you can probably immediately see, there's no shooting in this army. You don't, in my opinion, really need shooting against Empire. They could bring Pistoliers, but if my opponent really had decided to bring Pistoliers, I could one-zo them out with Bleak Swords, or if push came to shove, I could really just drop a Chill Wind on him with Malekith, and then try to catch him with the Slunish's Harvester. So that was what I kind of figured. Everything else, these guys are fast enough to catch him. Regardless, for the build, Malekith on a Lost Raptor. As usual, he's a very solid pick in almost every matchup, really. Lots of HP. With this sort of mounted on a Velociraptor, he's a bit, I think, in some ways more survivable than, say, a Dragon would be, because Empire has a lot of tools to snipe out area targets. So with this, he's much smaller to hit, much tougher to hit. He does have Gaze of Malice, which is very good against light Empire infantry. Stand your ground, Soul Stealers to heal himself up, Word of Pain, which I've been getting some more respect for. It's a very solid debuff, and while it does, the Overcast version can be good. I generally just stick to the normal version just for the reduced melee attack, but definitely Overcast can be very good on it as well. Then you do have to, as basically just an enhanced, when you Overcast it's basically just an enhanced enfeebling foe. Otherwise we do have Chill Wind to slow targets as well as to beat up on squishy infantry, Power of Darkness to improve power reserves if needed, and the Destroyer, because this is a really strong ability. If you can reset your opponent's cooldowns, it is very, very good. Finally, of course, Spiteful Conjuration, just to make all of my non-AP troops a little better. The front line very cheap, or relatively cheap, and relatively sort of weak. We do have Sisters of Slaughter anchoring things in the center, flanked by 2 units of Black Archers, who are then flanked by 2 units of Bleak Swords. So they'll do. This is a decent enough composition to take on, say, Flagellants, Sigmar Sons. They'll do okay against Halberdiers. They'll do okay against Swordsmen, units like that. They will not do well against Greatswords. My opponent brought quite a few Greatswords here in the center, but they can time down, buy me some time, and that is really what matters. Because the real strike force here is on the flanks. We've got 4 units of Cold War Knights, 2 groups of 2 here. These guys, of course, are not the greatest cavalry stat-wise, and they do have Rampage, but they do have 90 armor. They've got bronze shields. They've got not in the most inspiring melee stats, as we just mentioned, but they do have bonus first large, and they've got AP, which means that with an okay charge bonus and fear and all that sort of stuff, they will actually trade pretty well with, say, Reichsguard or Knights of the Blazing Sun, definitely in a very cost-efficient manner. I do believe they beat both of the Empire heavy cav units in a straight-up fight, and this is before we factor in debuffs. We do have on one flank Doomfire Warlocks, who do have a Lesser Doombolt as well as Soul Blight, and on the other flank the Slunish's Harvester. So 2 light cav units. These guys, of course, do a Soul Stealer as well as a Bound Word of Pain. So lots of magic, lots of debuffs, which can make and is going to make these Cold War Knights very competitive. Even Demigryph Knights with Halberds are not going to be able to deal with these guys if they're being hit by Word of Pain, if your opponent hasn't invested in some sort of countermeasures. For my opponent's front line, it is definitely where the main strike force is, definitely going for one of those sorts of greatsword heavy builds. Perfectly viable in my opinion nowadays, though I wouldn't recommend it against Dark Elves personally. Hammer of Sigmar on the Priests, Benediction, Shield of Faith, so it's usual sort of AoE defenses, providing for 2 greatswords apiece, 2 units of Warrior Priests here, so definitely potential to melt my front line. They are flanked by 2 Halberdiers, who with their recent buff to charge defense are a much nastier proposition, and can definitely lay the smackdown on a unit like Cold War Knights. They are backed by 2 crossbows, silver bullets, and spearmen, providing some additional peripheral support, and then the Hammer of Witches in the back. Now my opponent did not bring any casters, and although I do say that you don't need casters to do well, in this situation I probably would try to bring some, as Empire magic against Dark Elves is a very potentially a very potent tool. So my opponent did bring Karl here on a Pegasus, perfectly viable. He does have Golem Raz, of course. He does have Reichland Runefang, stand your ground, and hold the line. So some pretty good buffs, some potential for sniping out, say, Malekith. However, my opponent does not have a lot of flexibility here. Perhaps figuring that with such a small map he'll be able to play defensively. And despite going pretty heavy on this front line, he also did not really, he also kind of really heavily invested in this front line, which means he doesn't really have much protection here. So what I'm trying to do is exploit that, get around the flank, and harass. Now you can see over here my entire infantry formation shifting. Now granted, my sisters are here already getting peppered down by crossbows. They're very squishy. I'm getting a little bit of a Giz Malice here on these halberdiers, doing a bit of damage, just a touch there. Take him down by about 1300 HP, and you can see I've actually shifted the entire flank. I'm trying to hit my opponent on this flank, wrap around, and collapse this area. So you can see over here the Slashers, the Warflocks, and the Cold One Knights collapsing around the flank. Over on this flank, the Hammer of Witches has already knocked off 8 Cold One Knights, but now the Slashers Harvesters are just going to pile past the spears, push through, and go after the Hammer of Witches. They're going to be able to shut it down. And they're going to be able to start slaughtering the crew, which is huge. Once the Hammer of Witches goes offline, then my Cold War Knights can sweep around, and they're pretty safe at this point. Now, my opponent did shift his halberdiers a little bit, but I'm simply able to scoot around them with the Cold War Knights and aim for the backline. You can see that at this point, it is definitely being very badly compromised. The Doomfire Warlocks here taking an absolute beating from the Silver Bullets. You can see a small attack there coming, or one of the small Doom Bolts coming in on the Warrior Priest, not really doing very much. I was kind of hoping that it would do more, but as you can see, it did almost nothing. One kill, probably on the great swords, so nothing fancy. But nonetheless, you can see the halberdiers here collapsing with Malekith in there, with the Blackheart Corsairs and the Bleak Swords flanking them. They're going to collapse very quickly, and Karl Franz is now stuck, caught out, having tried to dive in against Malekith. And you can see the Soul Stealer is coming down. This one from the Doomfire Warlocks, I do believe, and it is just melting these great swords, is melting the Warrior Priest. They are surrounded. You can see the Sisters of Slaughter doing okay here, but they are obviously getting beaten down, but you can see Stand Your Ground coming down from Malekith. We are kind of sticking around here. The halberds shattering or breaking. Great Swords breaking. Warrior Priest breaks because that Soul Stealer just doing so much damage. And another Soul Stealer just coming down right away. You can see it just melting these troops. Once again, it's not going to snipe too many Great Swords, but it is going to melt down the Warrior Priest, and it is going to heal Malekith back up a huge amount. The backline in the meantime completely compromised. The spears, they'll do okay if you stay in there and just fight them with Slash's Harvesters, for example, and just a straight up fight, but they're not able to just stop these guys. They've got that 40% physical resist. My opponent didn't bring much magic damage, and now I'm on top of his Silver Bullets. Hammer of Witches shattered and fleeing. Cold One Knights providing fear and just disrupting these troops. The only units of Cold One Knights that are doing kind of badly are the ones who got caught out by Halberdiers. So these guys who are kind of left in there to shut down the crossbows are going to have a bad day. But, it's sacrifices have to be made, and because of that, my opponent is going to lose Karl Franz. He's going to lose this entire flank. Silver Bullets here wavering and then collapsing. The Slash's Harvesters just running amok up to 85 kills. These guys one of the really cool things actually about the Slash's Harvesters and Doomfire Warlocks in general is actually their weapon strength. Now granted, they're not amazing against, say, heavy cav. They're not amazing against those sorts of targets, of course, but they've got 45 weapon strength, which for a light cav unit, normally light cav sits around in the mid 20s, maybe the low 30s for some of the better light cav units. But Slash's Harvesters, Doomfire Warlocks, they're sitting at 45 weapon strength, which means that against these squishy infantry units, like Silver Bullets, like Crossbowmen, they will just annihilate them. At this point, my opponent is simply forced to GG out, as his army has essentially folded. So, is this build viable on every map? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I do think this is actually a very viable build against Empire as a whole. I'm not sold on it being viable in every map. If you get a very open, very big map, this build could struggle a bit. If your opponent decided to bring, say, now granted, if your opponent goes, this would rely on your opponent going a little campier. If your opponent goes with, say, a bunch of spears, backs it up with a little bit of heavy cav just to tie you down, and then focuses largely on artillery and gunpowder, he might be able to take this build on somewhat reliably, just because you can snipe the cold ones down a bit with cannons and bring them down in size before they manage to make contact. Otherwise, I think this is a very competitive build. I do think because you can take on Empire heavy cav. The two biggest threats to Dark Elves when you're dealing with Empire are heavy cav and shooting. The Empire front line is not going to be that much of a threat usually. You don't need to worry about them as much. So I think this build, you do have a decent enough front line. So if your opponent goes very chaff heavy, if your opponent does try to do one of those annoying chaff heavy builds, like what for example, my recommended build against Dark Elves, which is a whole bunch of spears backed by some unbreakable front line and then a bunch of handguns. This build has some infantry force that can take down that front line, trade fairly well with Flagellants, trade fairly well with Sigmar's Sons, and at the same time we've got enough cavalry to where I can oversaturate the backline, really deal with enemy troops, even if they've got a net, even if they've got infantry spears in the backline trying to just block you off. You've got a lot of cavalry here that can really disrupt. Plus you've got Malekith, who of course with Gaze of Malice can do an absolute beatdown on some of the backline troops. As you can see, Cold War Knights raking in great kills. Don't underestimate Cold War Knights. Now, I've used to say they're a one-shot wonder. Recently, with some testing, I think in certain cases they can be used as a real cav if you want. You have to be very wary of that rampage mechanic. You've got no way of healing them. You've got like Lizardmen, for example, can always heal up the horned ones. You've got no way of. Your Cold War Knights have very low HP as well. They've only got 4,300 HP, so you have to be very wary of rampage. But they're still a very potent. They're still a very potent unit. So definitely don't underestimate. They're very cheap for what they do. Now, granted, if they get rampaged, you're in for a world of hurt because you're going to. That's 1,000 gold down the drain if you haven't gotten some value out of them. But usually, you can, even if you have to throw them away, you can get at least some value back, and they definitely shut down enemy heavy cav in a straight up fight. Slash's Harvesters, great job. Same with the Doomfire Warlocks, tying down my opponent's backline, really disrupting, dropping those debuffs. And like I said, they're pretty good against squishy infantry. Low-end sort of state troops will not hold up too hot against Doomfire Warlocks or Slash's Harvesters, those sorts of units, just because they've got really solid damage per hit, even though it's not AP. For my opponent's build, although you can definitely get away with a Greatsword frontline in certain cases, I wouldn't. If I was going for a very sort of assault-heavy build like this, which is okay, like I said, it's a viable build if you really want to. But if you are going to do that, I think you don't want to be bringing a big backline. Bring heavy cav instead. Instead of this composition, you could dump the crossbows, dump the Hammer of Witches, probably dump the halberd. You can put in like a mortar maybe and a silver bullets, maybe just silver bullets. Get some heavy cav in there. 2 units of heavy cav, for example. Get some 2 Reichsguard in there. It's decent. They won't win any beauty contests against, say, Cold War Knights or anything like that, but they can do some good work. They can run over low-end infantry like that. And then, if your greatswords can potentially tear through Cold War Knights, especially if they're given some buffs. I'd also bring us Caster. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of sort of infantry-heavy builds against Dark Elves, because Dark Elves have the tools to punish it, but definitely Casters is something you would want with this sort of composition. Probably Lore of Light, and I'd definitely try to go a little lighter on this backline presence, because you just can't defend it if you're going this heavily into the front line. You just can't defend that. So regardless, good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below if you haven't already. As usual, guys, if you have any comments, any criticism, any questions about the game, anything like that, be sure to share them. Be sure to post down, and I will respond as soon as I can. And yeah, as usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye for now.